Hi everyone, how are you doing today? Sometimes I think that as readers or booktubers or audiobook listeners, however you enjoy classic literature, sometimes I think we tend to fall into these modes of thinking or perspectives where we just sort of group things together in these big umbrellas. And what I mean by that is, in my case, I'll say something like, I'll use a phrase like 19th century literature or 1920s literature, and as if that really has a very definite meaning. This is something that was really bothering me last night, and I thought, I'm going to make a video about this because I just think that there is so much diversity, so much variance among any era of literature. And I'm going to show you what I mean here. I've got together a stack of books from literally the mid 1800s. I'm going to show you how different these books are from each other. And we can talk about their similarities as well. But I just wanted to do this while it was still fresh in my mind. All right, first book up here is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Now, full transparency, this is a book I did not read all the way through. I believe that I had originally got to about here, maybe. Farther than this bookmark. This is my wonderful Boromir bookmark, which really dates this book in my collection. I believe that I had attempted to read this, about 13 years ago now. It's been a really, really long time, and I, again, have not yet finished it. But I think a lot of you are familiar with this story. It's about this young man who is falsely accused, arrested, and imprisoned. He makes a big escape from his imprisonment and is intent on wreaking vengeance upon the people that falsely accused him. Here's a nice blurb from William Thackeray. He began to read Monte Cristo at 6 one morning and never stopped till 11 at night. So depending on your reading speed, this may be not such a big book. For me, it would indeed be a very long read. One reason maybe I didn't finish it. But long story short, let's have a look here at the style and just the way he's setting up this story. So Chapter 1, The Arrival at Marseille. This is which translation is this? Translated by David Coward of Oxford University Press. On the 24th of February, 1815, the lookout of Notre Dame de la Garde signaled the three-master, the Pharaon, from Smyrna, Trieste, and Naples. As usual, a pilot put off immediately, and rounding the Chateau d'If, I don't know if I said that right, got on board the vessel between Cape Morillon and the Isle of Rion. Okay, so probably butchering all of these pronunciations. You know, it is a French novel. This is the English translation, and my French isn't anywhere near that good. Anyway, I think what I remember from reading whatever, I think it was 100 pages or whatever that I read originally, you know, this is told in a third person voice, and we do get to empathize with the characters, but I think the narrator maintains a pretty strong detachment, if you will, from the characters. So it's recounting what happens, and we understand how the characters feel and, you know, the troubles they're going through. But there's still a great deal of detachment, and you'll notice too that there's a lot of dialogue in this book. So it's not actually super heavy on descriptions and such. So yeah, I think it could be quite approachable in that sense. But so that's kind of how this one's written. Now I want to jump real quick. I'm doing this roughly in chronological order, but again, all these books were published relatively close to each other. Let's jump into Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, a classic many people read. And let's just take a look at the first page of this one. So it has that famous opening line. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. We had been wandering indeed in the leafless shrubbery an hour in the morning, but since dinner, Mrs. Reed, when there was no company, dined early. The cold winter wind had brought with it clouds so somber and a rain so penetrating that further outdoor exercise was now out of the question. I was glad of it. I never liked long walks, especially on chilly afternoons. Dreadful to me was the coming home in the raw twilight, with nipped fingers and toes, and a heart saddened by the chidings of Bessie the nurse, and humbled by the consciousness of my physical inferiority to Eliza, John, and Georgiana Reed. So, 2 paragraphs. First person, very straight to the point about a conflict here, very straight to the point about the character descriptions. I mean, we already have a sense of the narrator's place in the world, challenges they are facing, and a sense of loneliness. And also, Charlotte Brontë is really, she uses weather a lot, I would say, in her stories, and sometimes it even has a particular meaning, like the lightning bolt that strikes a tree later in Jane Eyre. But yeah, very, 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 very different than what we just read from Dumas. And I think that Bronte's sisters are indeed one of the more accessible of the 19th century authors because they often write from first person and they really are very immediate with the tension and the challenges of the characters. And so the whole book has that kind of immediacy, and I think that is one of the reasons it is so well loved. But before we paint even the Brontes in such a sweeping brush, I'll show you the beginning of Agnes Grey here, which is another great novel, one I haven't really talked about a lot on the channel. I've only read it once, but I found it very touching. It's certainly less dramatic than the other Brontë novels. In fact, I would say this is a very realistic novel, where in Jane Eyre you saw more of a fantasy portraying of being a governess, not for the challenges that the governess faced, but more of the, the whole romance with Mr. Rochester and stuff. Agnes Grey is a far more, I guess you could say, down-to-earth description of what it was like to work as a governess, one of the few jobs that were open to women in the 1800s. So she starts this book quite differently, although more similar to Charlotte's novel, The Professor. All true histories contain instruction, though in some the treasure may be hard to find, and when found so trivial in quantity that the dry, shriveled kernel scarcely compensates for the trouble of cracking the nut. Whether this be the case of my history or not, I am hardly competent to judge. I sometimes think it might prove useful to some, and entertaining to others, but the world may judge for itself, shielded by my own obscurity, and by the lapse of years, and a few fictitious names. I do not fear to venture, and will candidly lay before the public what I would not disclose to the most intimate friend. So this is a more, shall we say, I guess the style is a little bit more what you would expect of the 1800s, setting up this expectations for the reader, almost a very strong self-awareness that you're writing a book and sharing a story, and then she goes into her family background, which, again, if you were to pull out a particular trait of 1800s literature, I do think that the family backstory tends to be very prominent as an opener. But yeah, the whole book is written, as you can see, a little bit more, I would say, verbosely. I mean, she takes her time introducing characters, introducing the problems of her employment with this really unpleasant family. And there is a romance, but it's more of a slow burn romance. So that's Agnes Grey, again, quite different from Jane Eyre. And really the two books are not as comparable as you might think, being from sisters in the same family. And then let's talk about Nathaniel Hawthorne. So jumping across the pond, a lot of us in the U.S., well, not me per se, but others have been assigned reading Nathaniel Hawthorne. Actually, this was an assignment now that I think about it. This was in my American literature course in college, early American literature. I think Hawthorne may be one of the worst authors to assign people, not because he's not a great author. I love Hawthorne, but people tend to read his novels, and I think his short stories are more accessible. Here's the beginning of The House of the Seven Gables. Halfway down a by-street of one of our New England towns stands a rusty wooden house with 7 acutely peaked gables facing towards various points of the compass, and a huge clustered chimney in the midst. The street is Pinchin Street. The house is the old Pinchin house, and an elm tree of wide circumference, rooted before the door, is familiar to every town-born child by the name of the Pinchin Elm. On my occasional visits to the town aforesaid, I seldom failed to turn down Pinchin Street, for the sake of passing through the shadow of these two antiquities, the great elm tree and the weather-beaten edifice. Now, what a difference between this and Jane Eyre. This is truly signature Hawthorne style. He really likes to describe buildings, places, and he will spend his sweet time doing that. And if you're not along for the ride, then you're going to really find him frustrating to read. I mean, this is not the entirety of his description of this place. I mean, he goes on. Now, granted, the book is called The House of the Seven Gables, but I can tell you from having read other novels of his, he does the same thing. His book, The Marble Fawn, for example, which I think is my favorite novel by him. But it's basically one big travelogue about Rome, and he goes and describes all these sites in Rome, and that's most of the book, frankly. So, yeah, even when he gets to describing characters, he takes a lot of time. The dialogue, as you can see, is very few and far between in this first chapter. So, honestly, I would not be recommending this to high schoolers. I would say check out his short stories. Some of those are very readable, but, he has a very weighty style. And I think that's something I've noticed in general. Again, treading into dangerous water here, making generalizations. But I do think American literature tends to be a little weightier, at least pre-20th century. And I'm not really sure why that is. I mean, everybody knows Melville is famous for his meandering style that's very, very dense in terms of content. I don't actually know the reason for that. As far as the subject matter, both Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe were part of the dark romantic movement. And again, this is something that comes up a lot in American literature. Really tries to take on the ghosts of the past, in this case, the Puritans and their flaws, I guess. Hawthorne himself was descended from a judge who was involved in the Salem witch trials. So these sort of topics rested very heavily upon him. I don't know that that's necessarily the reason his style is like that, but yeah, very big difference. Very big difference. And then I'm just going to end here with our favorite here, right? Charles Dickens. I love Dickens, honestly. Although it's been a very long time since I read his novels. I read a great number of his novels when I was 12 or 13. And I just had a Dickens phase. And this was actually not, full disclosure, this was not one of the books I've read all the way through, but I've watched several television adaptations, so I really am familiar with the plot. And yeah, I do plan to read it, but let's look at the beginning of this one. And I really want to zoom in on the second paragraph of the opening chapter. Fog everywhere, fog up the river where it flows among green aits and meadows. Fog down the river where it rolls defiled among the tiers of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city. Fog on the Essex marshes, fog on the Kentish heights, fog creeping into the cabooses of collier brigs, fog lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships, fog drooping on the gunwales of barges and small boats. And that's just half of this paragraph. He goes on about the fog a great deal. And that's classic Dickens. He loves repetition for some of his setting the stage moments, like in A Tale of Two Cities. He's got the it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, which is the line everybody knows, but then he goes on and makes more comparisons, like between the monarchy of England and the monarchy of France, and he's got this whole thing that he does, and I would say it's kind of poetic. I mean, he really, again, like others, takes his time, but his style, yeah, poetic is indeed how I would describe it. Like up here, he says, as much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill. I mean, I don't think you would be seeing Charlotte Brontë or Nathaniel Hawthorne talking about dinosaurs in chapter 1 of their books. So that is Dickens. And then the fun thing that he does, I don't think it's in chapter 1 though. So, he starts out with this omniscient narrator, but at some point here, chapter 3, actually, he starts writing from first person from the perspective of Esther Summerson, who is the heroine of Bleak House. She is very similar to Jane Eyre in the sense she is an orphan, and she's considered rather, someone who doesn't get a lot of attention. She's not very glamorous, and a dutiful person, but someone with, a great deal of passion hidden within them. And I believe that the way Dickens handles this, although I can't remember for sure, I think some of the chapters are first person and others are third person, but it's interesting how he mixes those two. Here's the famous original illustrations that are kind of a little bit cartoonish, but they have a lot of charm. Anyway, again, big difference from any of the people we talked about previously. I would say that Dickens is actually not that difficult to read. He just tends to be very, very long. And the scope and the scale of Dickens is much bigger than some of these other books. Far bigger than Agnes Grey or even The House of the Seven Gables. Probably more comparable to the Count of Monte Cristo. So yeah, that was all I really had for this video. Just some random thoughts about, again, the differences you'll find in books written relatively close to each other from different countries, and just really, if you find yourself in a certain time period and you're just not feeling it, it really is worth trying a few other authors from that time period and see if there's something that is more appealing to you. And I would always look to the Brontës as a good entry point because, again, they do tend to be more immediate in their presentation of the story and really dig into the characters very quickly. So, thanks for watching. I hope you have a great rest of the week, and I will see you next time.